Hi, folks. Hope everyone is doing well. We're going to get started because we are prompt and on time. I want to introduce myself first. My name is Ruby Balaria Schifrin, and I am the head of the Housing and Affordability Program at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. At CZI, we believe everyone deserves a safe, affordable, accessible place to call home, and that's the only way we can get to shared prosperity. We believe in the 3 Ps, which I'm sure hopefully a lot of you have heard, right? We need to produce housing across income levels, we need to preserve existing housing, and we need to protect residents and tenants. And today, this panel is really all about housing preservation, which I'm really excited about, and also excited to be in person. It's been a while since myself, or I think our panelists also has done an in-person one, so apologize in advance if we're a little shaky. Before I introduce you guys to today's panelists, I just want to give a quick kind of background and overview here. You know, as many of you guys know, our housing crisis existed well before the COVID pandemic, but that's only really exacerbated the issues. We know we need to build more housing, but we also need to preserve existing housing, especially the naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH, which is the unsubsidized kind of housing that is the primary way that low-income folks get housed today. And so this is a critical part of the equation that, frankly, hasn't really been a dominant part of the narrative until recently. So we're really excited to dig more into this and for you to hear from some of our experts here on what we can do to preserve NOAH housing and to stabilize our communities. So our panelists here today, we have Lori Goodman, an Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute, Alejandro Martinez, the president of the Coalition for Responsible Community Development, or CRCD, and Caroline McCormick, a director of preservation at Enterprise Community Partners. And I'm going to pass it first to Lori, who can ground us a little bit in what NOAH is, some data around it, and help kind of provide some background. A little bit more background, sorry. So what is NOAH? NOAH, like we said, is naturally occurring. It tends to be typically older, smaller to mid-sized buildings that are generally owned by mom and pop landlords. And one of the things that's tricky about NOAH is that in high-cost markets, like the Bay Area and LA, it's really susceptible to kind of Wall Street and private corporate investors buying out and moving up market. And then in more low-cost markets, we see more deterioration and dilapidation in terms of housing quality. And the loss of this housing stock, like we were saying before, is really detrimental to lower-income communities. To put this into perspective, roughly 100,000 NOAH units are raised each year. And this really leads to greater displacement and gentrification, especially in Black and brown communities. And so simply put, we truly believe that creating a more equitable and affordable housing system means we need to explore the stabilization and preservation of NOAH assets. And now I'll pass it to Lori.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm going to actually present some national numbers on how desperate the lack of NOAH housing is. So, as Ruby mentioned, NOAH refers to residential rental properties that are affordable but are unsubsidized by any federal program. The rents on these properties are relatively low as compared with other properties in the local housing market, and the need for affordable properties is just huge. And as Ruby mentioned, preservation is important as these units are generally older, in less good shape, and are in increasingly scarce supply. So first, to put this into perspective, it's important to realize that renter incomes are relatively low as compared to homeowner incomes. So of renters, 57% of renters nationally earn under $50,000, and 30% of renters nationally earn under $25,000. By contrast, only 28% of homeowners earn under $50,000, and 11% earn under $25,000. So renters are by and large much less affluent to begin with. And this is a fairly shocking number. 3 out of every 4 renter households who qualify for federally subsidized housing don't receive it because of lack of funding. So, so basically, there are 5.2 million families who are receiving federally subsidized housing, and 16 million families that qualify it who don't receive federally subsidized housing. Those 5.2 million households include the 2.3 million that receive housing choice vouchers, 1.2 million who live in project-based Section 8 housing, and about 900,000 who live in public housing. Those are the largest 3 programs. But again, key fact, 3 out of every 4 renter households who qualify for federally subsidized housing don't receive it. A huge percentage of renter households are cost burdened. And you can see here that 20 million rental households, or 47% of all rental households, pay more than 30% of their income on rent. 10 million of the renter households, that is close to 25%, are severely cost burdened. That is, they pay more than 50% of their income on rent. So just sort of it shows you the need for affordable housing. And of course, lower income renters are disproportionately cost burdened. For those earning under $25,000 a year, 90% are at least moderately cost burdened, and 70% are severely cost burdened. Of those earning $25,000 to $50,000 a year, about 75% are at least moderately cost burdened, and 20% are severely cost burdened. And not surprisingly, the cost burdens are especially pervasive in areas with less federally subsidized housing. So with this slide, which is taken from some National Low-Income Housing Housing Council tabulations show the HUD-assisted share of the rental stock versus the severely cost-burdened share of extremely low-income rental households, and you can see there's a fairly tight relationship. Those areas that have less HUD-assisted housing tend to have a much higher share of severely cost-burdened renters. There is simply not enough naturally occurring affordable housing available to fill the gap. So this shows you for each income level cumulatively how many households there are, which is the blue line, and how many units are affordable and available. That is, if a unit is rented by a higher income individual, it's not available. So of the 10.8 million extremely low income renter households, there are 4 million units that are affordable to them. Of the 37% of extremely low income households could find affordable units. There's a deficit of 6.8 million units. Of those who earn less than 50 AMI, there's 17, and I realize the scale is missing from this slide, but there are 17.7 million households. The number of rental units that are affordable and available is only 10.6 million. So 60% of those households could find affordable and available rental units. And the deficit is 7.1 million. For those earning less than 80 AMI, 26.4 million units available, 26.4 million households, 25.4 million available, a deficit of 1.5 million. By the time you get to 100 AMI, it's pretty equal. But bottom line, for those lower income individuals, there's just not enough naturally occurring affordable housing that is available. And it's important to realize that the more affordable the housing it is, the generally older it is. So this basically shows you mean and median rents for housing by year. So that for those before 1960, the median rent is a little over $800 a month, going up to around $1,300 a month for those built in 2010 and older. The mean rent is about $1,100 a month for units built before 1960. For units built after 2010, it's around close to $1,600, and you can see it's monotonically increasing. So more affordable housing is generally older, and older housing is generally in less good shape. This shows you the share of rental units that are either moderately or severely inadequate. And the definition of moderately and severely inadequate is a definition that is the unit is close to being uninhabitable. So for those that are moderately inadequate, about 11% of units before 1940 are moderately inadequate. About 4% of units built in the 2000 to 2019 period are moderately inadequate. Severely inadequate, about 4% of those built before 1940, less than 1% of those built in 2000 to 2019. So older housing is generally in much less good shape. Now it's important to realize when we talk about naturally occurring affordable housing, we're talking about all structure types. So when you look at the number of rental units in thousands, you can see that the biggest chunks of rental housing are either one unit, which is about 17 million units, or 36% of the total, or 50 plus units, which is about 16.5 million units, or 34% of the total. I want to point out that 2 to 4 units, which are the most affordable, is about 6 million units, or 13.1% of the total, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. When you look at the right-hand side of the screen, what you see is that the lowest rents are in the 2 to 4 units and in the 5 to 9 units. The highest rents are in buildings with 50 plus units. But if you look at the far right column, this shows you the share with rent less than $800 a month. And you can see that for every single category, there for one units, 36.8% have a share less than $800 a month. 2 to 4 units, 45.6%. 5 to 9 units, 40%, and even 50 plus units, 30% rent for less than $800 a month. So NOAA housing encompasses all structure types. When you look at landlord and tenant rate ethnicity by structure type, you can see that the most affordable housing was in the 2 to 4 units, and you'll notice that on the left-hand side, the number of white households, the number of white landlords is actually lowest in the 2 to 4 units. That is, about 61% of landlords in 2 to 4 units are white. About 13.2% are black, 14.9% Hispanic, and 10.2% other. When you look at the tenant community, you see exactly the same thing. The lowest percentage of white tenants are in the units with the most affordable rents. That is, in the 2 to 4 units, and actually 5 to 49 has relatively few white families as well. So again, when you look at race ethnicity and the rents people pay are very, very highly correlated, as they are with income. And then to pick up the point that Ruby made earlier, naturally occurring affordable housing is disappearing very, very quickly. You can see from 2011 to 2019, we went from about 14 million units that rent for less than $600 a month to 10 million units that rent for $600 a month. So we went from 32% of the rental housing stock to about 22% of the rental housing stock. And just to put this in perspective, if a family making $24,000 a year could afford to pay about $600 a month on rent if they spent 30% of their income on rent. And you can see the number of units is way, way down. These were 2019 numbers, and it's important to realize that rents are increasing very, very rapidly, which is exacerbating the affordability problem. So the rental increases during the pandemic have just been huge. So you're seeing overall close to 12 to 13% rental increases nationwide. Obviously, more in some areas, less than other areas. Now, what this does is, there are a lot of small landlords out there, and they're obviously very tempted to raise the rent. On the other hand, they know their tenants can't afford to pay. They can't afford to pay. And a lot of them, their tenants haven't been able to pay during the pandemic. We actually, or pay the full amount during the pandemic. Obviously, the emergency rental assistance has helped some of these guys. We collaborate with Avail, which is a vendor to the mom and pop landlords, on a survey, and we asked them, in one of our recent surveys, we asked them, do you have plans to sell your rental property in the next 12 months? In total, about 16% had plans to sell their rental property. And most of these landlords have 1 to 3 properties. Of those that missed rental income, 24% planned to sell. And of those who did not miss rental income, only 11% planned to sell. And obviously, when these small landlords sell, they tend to sell to people who are going to raise the rent. Then they were asked further, what factors influenced your decision to decide to sell your property? Obviously, increased property value was very important for everyone. But then for the smaller landlords who had missed rental income, which is basically those that rented to less affluent tenants, difficulty collecting rent factored into about 37% of the decisions. No longer want to be a landlord factored into 29% of the decisions. And rental income doesn't cover the costs of my owning the home factored into about 25% of the decisions. If you look at those numbers versus those that did not miss rental income, you can see there are just huge differences. So again, those mom and pop landlords that are renting to less affluent renters have been the hard hit, and are those that are thinking of selling. Should I talk about the NOAA? Yeah. Okay. So Ruby had asked me to talk a little bit about what we do and don't know about NOAA housing. And the answer is we actually know very, very little. There's no sort of standard acceptable definition of what is a natural occurring affordable housing unit. But even if we put in a standard definition, those units that are affordable to ADA-MI, we don't really know how many units there are, either nationwide or by market. We don't know how many of these units are in need of repair, either nationwide or by market. More importantly, we don't know how much the change in home ownership affects preserving these units as affordable housing. So if I'm a mom and pop landlord who's going to sell to someone who's going to do a lot of renovation and raise the rent, that is not being preserved as affordable housing. On the other hand, you do want to do some preservation to keep the unit habitable. We don't know what the ownership structure is by structure type. That is, we know that X% of one units are owned by LLCs, but we don't know if the LLC is Ruby, who owns one property and is incorporating as an LLC so that if someone slips on the porch that she doesn't get sued, or if the LLC is an institutional landlord who owns lots of properties. And so we don't really know what the relationship is between affordability and landlord type. So we really don't know, and most importantly, we don't know if there's a change in ownership, what ends up happening to the property itself, what happens to the rents, and what happens to the tenants. What are the outcomes for the units that are not preserved? Um, and then, what are the most effective strategies to preserve affordable housing, which we're going to be talking about a lot more later in this panel? Are there some strategies that are more or less effective in different types of markets? And what can different stakeholders do to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, which is so desperately needed?
Thank you so much. You would have thought we had so much figured out with that wealth of data that Lori provided, but as you can see, there's still a lot of gaps. And it's still an opportunity for folks to dig in deeper in this and to kind of look for more innovative solutions, which now we're going to actually turn to Alejandro, who's going to talk about that a little bit. So Alejandro and CRCD worked with Enterprise Community Partners, not Caroline, but other folks at Enterprise, and CZI to help launch a pilot in LA called the Local Renter Owner Collaborative. So Alejandro, can you tell us a little bit more about the vision and the collaboration behind this approach and what it aims to do?
It was a wonderful program. But truly, it was, I think, a program that was really necessary for the small landlords in South LA. It's a program that I think many of us as developers, and there's a lot of developers, lenders, and other folks in community development here, I think really take for granted. But I think arguably, specifically in South Los Angeles, in the target area, arguably these landlords and the tenants that live in their buildings are the foundation of our neighborhoods. These owners represent thousands and tens of thousands of seniors, of young families, low-income families, residents with physical and mental disabilities. I mean, you name it. These are the folks that we see on a daily basis as when we go to work. These are the folks that shop, in the neighborhood stores, get their haircut at beauty salon, go to the local pharmacy. So I think having a program that specifically targeted these types of landlords, these property owners, these small small, we're looking at 2 to 20 units, is critically important. One of the comments that we received early on from a lot of landlords, they were very thankful because this is a program that they could actually qualify for and apply for, right? Usually folks say, well, there are no programs that fit what we do. Many times they felt that they were overlooked. They're not your new tax credit projects with all the bells and whistles. These are 2 to 20 unit projects. Anyhow, for I think the residents that were able to benefit, whether they were a tenant or a landlord, this program was just really truly amazing. I want to talk a little bit about TRCD and what we do. We just celebrated our 16th anniversary this January. We're a community economic development corporation located in South Los Angeles, along the historic Vernon Central corridor. We provide a variety of services. It's pretty awesome. We provide supportive services, affordable housing. We have a charter school. We have a workforce center. We have social enterprises. We have a construction company. We'll have folks that come in on a daily basis and they'll need emergency housing. So we have a rapid housing program where we'll get them to emergency housing. So when we were approached to participate in this initiative, we were just overwhelmed because truly this is the neighborhood that we work and live and provide these services. And to know that we could potentially have a huge effect on potentially thousands of individuals was just a really unique opportunity. I do want to talk about the program. I'm going to go over some facts, and then I think at the end we'll talk about just the reasons, the why, the questions, and some solutions, and we'll go over all that good stuff. So let me, the objectives. I can't read that, so I'm going to look at my phone. The objectives are simple: to stabilize BIPOC property owners and renters at greatest risk of really the economic uncertainty that we're facing with COVID. We wanted to keep lower income folks housed. What happened? We wanted to learn from our mistakes. So what happened in the last recession, specifically in South LA and in other parts of this country, we saw Wall Street come in and buy houses, duplexes, you name it, in the hood, in the inner city, in bulk. They bought them straight from the lenders, and now we're seeing the effects of that, of whatever that caused. We can call it whatever we want, but in South LA specifically, you could see it when you drive by some of our neighborhoods. You can actually see the homes that were purchased by these outside investors. So we wanted to do our part by addressing that. We really truly wanted to help people. We had this, I think it was early on, we talked about operating with this truth model where we trusted people. If we asked them these very basic questions to be able to qualify for the program, we were not going to research and try to catch them. We were going to take their word for it, which was a very just unique opportunity for us to say, wait a minute, we want to help you succeed, and we're going to do it in a way where we're going to take your word for it. We will ask for some basic information, but we want to make sure that we are as open, transparent, and as helpful as possible, because in our communities, folks have a history of being taken advantage of by unscrupulous developers, brokers, investors, I mean, you name it. So we were walking into a situation where we knew that we had to step forward and just be open about our intentions. Okay, I'll go here. Our partners, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Enterprise, Avail, the Roy and Patricia Disney Foundation, the Ralph Parsons Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, and Zacento was one of our partners. Our target area was very specific, which is very cool. If you're familiar with Los Angeles, it was south of the 10, east of the 110, west of Alameda, and north of the 105. Very specific. We did that for a couple reasons. One, it's a demonstration project, so we knew that if we target a larger geography, that we would be overwhelmed. We thought that we were going to have people lined outside, that there would be thousands and thousands of people coming to our offices, so we wanted to keep the geography, at least the initial geography, within our traditional boundaries. And this is generally the boundaries that our nonprofit operates in. So the program, again, the program was very unique, where we said we told folks, hey, if you've been affected by COVID, if you've had tenants who haven't been able to pay rent for the last 19 months, reach out and we will help you. We will help you by making you whole. And this is, again, just very interesting to folks, because we had folks not apply or were hesitant to apply because it seemed too good to be true. They may know about CRCD or have heard of the organization, but why? Like, why would Alejandro or Mark or Ernesto just do this? It just doesn't make sense, right? So interestingly enough, that was one of our challenges, was just convincing folks that this was a real program and that we truly wanted to help them. Which is awesome. Avail, again, was mentioned earlier. It's a very unique property management software that was designed to help these small and medium property owners. It helps them with rent collection. It helps them with just keeping their leases together and managing that. And it's just a great resource. So we partnered with Avail to also help create the website and the portal to help folks apply. Um, Another neat thing, besides the making them whole with the rental arrears, we want to make sure that we helped the landlords with just other maintenance issues. If they had the ability to increase their cash flow by making improvements to their utility, to things that increase their utility expenses, maybe these landlords could benefit by having solar panels or by having different type of landscaping, or maybe by replacing the windows or what have you. We want to make sure that the program also set aside funds to help the owners improve their properties, with the thought that if they could reduce their operating expenses, they would have less reason to want to sell it or increase the rents. Um, And this slide just highlights the different program aspects, different supportive. Oh, thank you.
I should have done that earlier.
Programs
Sorry.
that either the landlord or the tenants were eligible for. A lot of this was, sometimes it was as simple as a mediation services between the landlords and the tenants, or maybe the landlords reached out to us for financial literacy or some sort of just financial education. Okay. Oh, this is good stuff. Okay. So we were able to help over 105 units, and this represents hundreds and hundreds of tenants. On average, I think it's safe to assume that we probably have between 3 and 4 individuals per unit. And again, this is in a very small part of South Los Angeles. And the total amount of direct resources, direct rental arrears that we were able to get in the hands of landlords as of January was almost $1.5 million. And the reason that we chose for the funds to go to the landlords directly, we knew that to manage this program could be potentially just this immense project. The city and the county and the state had other similar programs, but their infrastructure was ginormous. This was just CZI, CRCD, Enterprise, and Avail. I'm just always, when I think back about the program, impressed on how much we were able to do in such short amount of time. And to give folks just a sense of how quickly this program got up and running, we were selected on February 4th. And the program launched April of last year. So that was pretty quick. Oh, thank you. And here's just another list of some of the services that we were able to provide: just financial services, debt relief, financial counseling, mediation, vacancy assistance. Because we have a rapid rehousing program, we also have the ability to place folks. Again, folks walk into our offices every day, and sometimes they just need food, clothing, or a place to sleep. And folks who are interested in an emergency voucher, we can actually get them into housing. So we are working with the tenants to help them lease their units in those cases. And again, because we offer a variety of other supportive services, we can help the tenants with, job training, education, case management, just other supportive services that are really critical for their success.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alejandro. I think that was a great summary, and we're really proud of, the speed on this was to meet the immediate need of the COVID impact, right, and ensure that, I'm sure you guys have heard now multiple stories of the uptick in corporate acquisition of properties, especially in this 2 to 4 unit category. It's kind of like the next single family, portfolio buy. And so focusing also in a really hard to reach market, like South Central LA, where there is a lot of distrust and, a lot of folks who are reeling still from the first financial crisis or the previous financial crisis and all the wealth lost in that. Thinking about preserving this housing stock and keeping those owners in place was so key, and CRCD's role in being that glue and doing that on the grounds work was absolutely essential. every single one of the owners, we had a convening with them, said that they had been reached out to by private equity. Every single one. And almost every single one were like, yeah, I was definitely thinking about selling. Like this was too stressful. And so I think this is a microcosm, right? It's a small pilot, but there's so much more that I think we're still learning on it, which is exciting. So in the interest of time, we're gonna move on to Caroline, but because I do want to leave also time at the end for Q&A from you guys too. So Caroline, let's hear a little bit more about preservation in the Bay Area specifically.
Sure, and you'll notice that we're going to do a slight sort of definition switch here. We were using NOAA previously. Enterprise uses unsubsidized affordable housing because we don't think there's anything natural about how this housing happened. There are economic and social forces that led to disinvestment and redlining of many of these properties. And to Lori's, some of her earlier points, it's often in terrible condition, and low-income renters are paying upwards of 50 to 70% rent burden in many times. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just wanted to set that sort of definition change there. So going up to the Bay Area here, and I'm going to just go through some of the data points real quick on this slide. We did take a shot at measuring sort of this housing. In 2020, we came out with a report that looked at the state of unsubsidized affordable housing in the Bay Area. You see, this is a little bit dated at this point. In 2012, there were roughly 450,000 unsubsidized affordable units in the 9-county region. In 2017, we were down to 280,000, so losing roughly 32,000 unsubsidized affordable units a year. So that's just setting some Bay Area context there. And what Enterprise is kind of focused on is resolving some of the challenges to reaching this particular housing stock. Number one, to my earlier slide, the scale of the problem of how we're losing so many units every year. The existing programs, sort of disparate programs across the 9-county region, do not meet the need. And so really trying to focus on how we scale the acquisition and rehab of these buildings. Alejandro talked about sort of one model of working with existing landlords to stabilize housing. We also support the funding primarily nonprofit developers to acquire and rehab these projects and put long-term deed restrictions on them. And there's just simply not enough permanent source subsidy for these programs. There's roughly 3 kind of regular local programs to support the acquisition of unsubsidized affordable housing. You have the Small Sites program in San Francisco. That's where I'm most recently coming from. San Mateo has a program, as does the city of Oakland. And it's just sort of not enough to meet the need in any one of those cities, and definitely not across the region, as many cities don't have existing programs. So that continues to be, how do we bring more resources into preserving these homes? Developer capacity is another thing we focus on. There are some folks who are already developers who operate in this space. There's also a lot of developers who are new and emerging in this field, and really need the upfront access to flexible financing, to pre-development financing, to do some due diligence on these projects, and put down deposits, pay for appraisals, these kinds of things. So really, that being a challenge to scaling as we have more developers and emerging developers in particular, in addition to supporting them with skills building and training and networking. It's also like access to the financing needed to do these deals. Also, one thing we talked a lot about in San Francisco as the program, was almost 10 years into operation, is the long-term asset management. Having, 2 to 4 unit buildings spread across a long sort of geographic or large geographic area is challenging. How do we deal with that sort of long-term asset management and sort of repositioning as these portfolios grow? So in sort of diving into the opportunity side, and I won't go too much into this because my colleague Justine, who I see in the audience, talked a bit about the capital resources coming down the line. Enterprise is really focused on getting more permanent source funding for these projects. So to name a few things that we were a part of, the $500 million foreclosure intervention housing preservation program. That's a program that HCD is in the process of implementing right now. That's for 1 to 25 unit buildings, really flexible sort of subsidy to acquire those buildings. We're still waiting to see sort of the program guidance and how that loan product will be structured, but it's a promising opportunity to reach this housing type. Justine at the last preservation panel really went into the details of the Community Anti-Displacement Preservation Program, CAP. That's another $500 million program that's budget requests in this next round. And that is more broadly preservation, not just sort of 1 to 25 units. It's more broadly acquisition, so also promising. And lastly, the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency was established and will be supporting a regional housing bond, $10 billion regional housing bond, and 15% of that housing bond would be allocated towards preservation. So really focusing on how do we get those sources of funding that can be used across the region. On the developer networks and capacity building front, how do we ensure that programs like FIP and CAP also prioritize technical assistance and sort of pre-development financing products, having that be part of the, in addition to the ACC rehab financing, making sure that those other important pieces are a part of the budget. And then lastly, we're starting to talk a lot about how do you shared centralized systems to increase efficiencies for these projects, both at sort of the individual developer level, but also like, could we do a New York joint ownership entity type model for the Bay Area to really, scale these projects, but also make sure in the long term that they sort of remain healthy. So that's sort of a recap of what we see as the challenges and opportunities. And then I won't go too much into this slide, but this just reiterates the many things that Enterprise is working on. Talked a little bit about the capital piece. We also support sort of accompanying policies like COPA and TOPA that help give nonprofit developers and residents the first right to purchase these buildings. Talked about BAFA measure. Talked a little bit about regional preservation and developer capacity building. Enterprise also has some loan products specifically for preservation, our Bay Area Preservation Pilot, and then Housing for Health Fund. So with that, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One thing that I really gleaned, I think, from the three of you is how essential these preservation strategies are in general, and how we're both hemorrhaging, the loss of these units and not building enough new affordable units. And so it feels like we're sinking. And so we need to focus on an all of the above strategy if we're going to get out of this. But before I turn to the audience for Q&A, I painted kind of a bleak picture. I think there's still a lot of room for hope, and some of the stuff that you pointed out, Carolyn, also in the Bay Area. I know LA is also trying to set up a similar agency like BAFA. Is there any other things that you three would give out as a source of hope or opportunities for NOAA preservation, or I should say unsubsidized housing preservation?
If I can, I think the time is now for us to be innovative, creative, but also to ask our lenders and to step up, our lenders and foundations in the city and the county, basically everyone who'll listen to us. There was a time where, especially in LA, where it was possible to buy these buildings as a either for-profit or not. You could do this. It was still brain damage, but it was possible. And what's interesting is that because of COVID, the economy, everything that's happening in society, um, funders are starting to ask what can they do. They're seeing all the homelessness, all the encampments. I mean, they're driving these streets just like us, right? And they're starting to ask us how can they help. And I say this, it's so obvious, but I had a conversation with the funder maybe about 6 months ago, and they asked me, they said, Alejandro, why are you not building this housing? And I said, with all due respect, you don't fund it. And he just looked at me like, I said, I would build it, but you all in the lending community, the CDFIs, you don't have a product for me to access, for me to buy this, to give you what you want, to give you what the city and the community needs, right? So it's one thing for you to want us to do this, but someone has to step up. Somebody needs to have a product that we can access for us to buy these. And without that, it's going to be extremely difficult. It really is. And we have to be able to move on these opportunities as quickly and efficiently and effectively as market rate developers, because guess what? They're buying them, right? And they're not keeping them affordable. They're buying them to get a return. And the reality is, for them to get a return based on today's market prices, they're going to have to evict folks in however way they do it, cash for keys, or in maybe a more aggressive way. But they're going to do that because one thing that market rate developers don't do, they don't lose money. And they don't lose money on these transactions. So they can get really aggressive, really nasty. But if the lending community that we work with really want us to go after these and to make these a priority, they have to have a product that we can access, and quickly. Because these small mom and pop property owners, when they are ready to sell, they're not going to want to give us 90 to 120 day escrow like we do on our tax credit projects. They're not, because we're going to be competing with market rate folks that are willing to write a check in 30 days. So I would just say, as folks that are interested, use this time, use this opportunity to make your asks, whatever that ask may be appropriate for you.
And I was just going to add one thing to that, and that is that, we have a lot of federal financing programs for home ownership, and none of them actually do allow for you to buy, for a homeowner to, a potential borrower to buy a home and finance it and renovate it in a reasonable manner. Our federal renovation programs are just extremely clunky and really not very attractive. So, for example, if that mom and pop investor that Alejandro talked about wants to sell to another mom and pop investor, that second mom and pop investor could get a Fannie or Freddie loan to buy the property, but the renovation is very, very difficult. Their lender would Fannie or Freddie would have recourse to the lender until the landlord actually completes the renovation, which of course makes it not very attractive to the lender, which explains why very few lenders are involved. The FHA programs are clunky, so sort of thinking about improvements to the federal financing of these properties, I think, is really, really critical.
I would just add, so you already kind of lifted up the, having funding, secured funding and then potential opportunity for more sort of perm source funding. I would also add that we're just seeing more local jurisdictions invested in building out preservation programs, whether or not they have the sort of subsidy to provide yet, but really focusing on how do we set up a TOPA COPA framework and really focus on preservation as a sort of policy priority for us as a local jurisdiction. And now we just got to get them that sort of regional and state funding to be able to deploy on actual projects.
Yeah, love that. Okay, questions from the audience? Should I come over with this mic or you go? Thanks. Sorry, you're next.
for the landlords that were participating? Like, did you say, hey, you need to, make sure you don't sell the property for a year or 2 years, or was it just you were focused on really trying to keep the housing affordable for, a short period of time? So you weren't really, requiring those kinds of things.
So the short answer is yes and no. Um, those agreements that you would think that we would put in place to require them not to sell, we didn't do that. What we did ask for them to not do is if the program paid for the rent, if the programs made them whole, then the owner would agree not to evict folks for non-payment of rent, because if we've made them whole, they should stop the eviction process. So we did have them agree to that in writing. We thought about putting in some other provision so that they couldn't sell, but one, that would be difficult, one to do and to enforce and to monitor, and then two, folks, already had a hard time trusting us that this was real, that we were not going to give them this funding and then try to come in and take their property from them. So folks, they read the agreement, they asked questions, and we also didn't want to, make them feel like they're going to be obligated to us in some other way. We try to make it as easy as possible. Give us the data, the facts, how much do people, owe you, and we will fund you. I mean, it was pretty easy. But that was, a longer conversation that we had, and we had a lot of those conversations about, well, should we do this and should we do that? And the reality is that if we were going to put this money out in the streets into the hands of these landlords, that was just not an efficient way of doing it.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, we did a bunch of focus groups with owners right before this, with also from different geographies, of different races. It was a really diverse group. And we wanted to put some kind of like TOPA, COPA, first right of refusal if you do end up selling. And almost all of them were like, we will not sign up.
Yeah.
There was a true fear. There has been a huge kind of misinformation campaign that tenants will purposefully stop paying rent so that they can buy the building. Or some of these are the things that they're hearing and believing. And so there's some work to do on the grounds of convincing folks. This guy up front.
I'll do it without a mic, but, so we're from the city of South Lake Tahoe, and it really perfectly encapsulates as a case study everything that's being discussed about here. So we're heavily impacted by increased rents, decreasing housing supply of rental, but we're a small community. We don't really have the resources from a community partner perspective that LA, Bay Area does, but we have that kind of impact from those areas. Is there, I guess, question for the panelists really is, are you aware of any groups that are available to help cities kind of like South Lake Tahoe that have big city problems but are relatively small cities, help set up a acquisition and rehab program to help keep the supply of this unsubsidized affordable housing that is really critical to our affordable housing strategy? So I hope that makes sense, but any resources that might be available for smaller communities? Thanks.
Yeah, so one of the ones that's actually kind of almost live is a statewide program called the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program. So it's 1 to 25 unit buildings. There has to be some sort, right now the way it's written, it has to be some sort of foreclosure risk. I think we're working to advocate for that to be as broad of a definition as possible, in which case, it could be utilized more broadly, but that's a statewide resource that it's going to get administered through a network of community development financial institutions. So it'll go live likely by the end of the year.
That's exactly the question is that program is geared towards CFIs. We don't have those in the city. So are you aware of groups
So they would be responsible for deploying the funds throughout the entire state, and making sure that they're sort of reaching multiple geographies at the statewide level. So it's a statewide resource that would be available, across the state.
But
And
do you
this-
know if it goes just to nonprofit, like just to CDFIs, or can it be granted to nonprofits too?
So it's administered to CDFIs, and then they'll be the ones originating the loans for the nonprofit entities. I don't know, is it just nonprofits, Justine? Okay. Public agencies too.
Stephanie Reyes, that was her
Yeah.
name. Okay,
No,
Lori, I think you were.
Yeah, I was going to actually sort of in a different vein. There are a number of cities that have done private-public partnerships where they've established funds to buy these affordable housing, to buy sort of naturally occurring affordable housing. In some cases, they've issued bonds. In other cases, they've used public money. The city of Charlotte has a very, very vibrant program, but there are a number, probably a half a dozen cities have done reasonably successful programs.
Great. We got a question in the back. All the way. Sorry, I'm making you run around with that mic.
I had a question to the extent you're talking about habitability issues. If there's conversations with insurance companies and the role that they have to play in ensuring that those properties are appropriately insured. And I also didn't have a sense of were there mortgages carried on these properties, or were they owned by them? Because the other concern is when they're not insured, that's another potential loss. But it would seem like if the insurance companies are involved, then the habitability issues could be contained in theory.
You would think that.
Yes, you would think that. But, but also to the extent that insurance companies may also have an interest in being at the table to support financially, and maybe not, but maybe that's also something that we should be looking at leveraging for these units.
I think it would be wonderful. So one of the challenges is that, they all have different insurance companies, right? Some of them are the major ones, and some of them are insurance companies that we've never even heard of. So one great thing about what we're hoping to do as part of this is that we've had conversations about us having the ability to create this collaborative with these landlords to do these bulk buys, for lack of a better term, to reach out to one insurance company and say, hey, will you insure all of these folks at a reduced rate of whatever it is? We're also having conversations with, internal conversations about whether we can work with maybe one lender, maybe a lender in this room that's willing to say, hey, will you take on all these 50 properties and refinance them and get them into a better product that they have right now? So if lenders are in this room, please reach out to us. But the other key thing about it is that we want to make sure that Alejandro isn't pushing this, that this is truly coming from the collaborative. So all we can do is have conversations with the landlords, talk to them about our resources, our network, because you all now are part of our network, and try to see what they're willing to do. And hopefully we can get to the point where we can have, one insurance company or one lender do these things, or one maintenance company, or a management company, or a landscape company. How can we get some economies of scale to these small landlords that large multifamily projects benefit from? So we are having those conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question. HPN, for example, Housing Partnership Network, did a group insurance for nonprofit affordable housing developers, and that was a way to drive down costs and help with stuff like you're saying. But that's a great question. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering, I am on the board of a housing authority in the city of Berkeley, and we have, have our Section 8 program and housing choice vouchers, and are finding a terrible time in being able to find landlords who will actually take the vouchers, especially with EHVs and mainstream vouchers, which are targeting homeless or folks who are at risk of homelessness. So we've been talking about a strategy, and I'm curious to hear if you all have heard of this or thought about this, of really pushing for our project-based vouchers to be used not just to support new affordable housing finance, and this might be a little controversial in this room, but to actually use PVVs for acquisition. And so we did that with a community land trust. We did one project last year as kind of a trial. And the exciting thing for us, I know PVVs are so competitive, and so we don't want to be taking like robbing Peter to pay Paul. But a lot of housing authorities, HUD is really expanding the MTW program right now, which means that a lot of the housing authorities, including our own, are getting a lot more flexibility in how many of our vouchers we can actually project base. And so I'm just curious if there's been any discussion or thought about partnerships with housing authorities using project-based vouchers in acquisition and NOAA strategies.
Not in Los Angeles that I'm aware of, but we did have conversations with the housing authority back in the early 2000s about doing that for home ownership. The challenge is this being recorded? Is working with the housing authority. It's a large institution, right? So their challenges, just like you said, are spot on. Is if you do this, you're doing it at the cost of X, right? And then you can have a larger conversation about the intent of that. We wanted to do that, but the logistics of it were extremely difficult, and the timing, because again, if it's a NOAA property, can the housing authority, and maybe since you're on the board, can you do that in an effective and efficient manner where a group, let's say a nonprofit, can make an offer on a building and have that process be, just not even mentioned to the seller that they're doing this, because the seller at the end of the day, they want their cash. So can you create a program with let's say a nonprofit where you have a partnership, nonprofit makes an offer on a building, and they buy it 30 days after their due diligence without having a 9-month process? I think that's going to be the key, because as a seller, if they have several offers, because right now they're going to have several offers, they're going to take the highest one, the folks who can close as fast as possible. They're not going to give the nonprofit the time of day to wait 9 months for a program to be created. If you can do it, it would be fantastic, I think.
Just, I guess, cite one example from when I was at the city of San Francisco that's kind of getting to what you're asking a bit, is we did provide, if Mission Housing is in the room, they could speak to this project too, but we provided acquisition funding to acquire an SRO that was like on the same block as 2 other buildings in their portfolio that had PVVs. And then we did like a scattered site tax credit deal where those PVVs were sort of helping cross-subsidize the site that we acquired. So that's sort of one example. Not PVV, but in San Francisco, also we did a fair amount of pairing the sort of small and large, not a fair amount, we should have done more, but sort of smaller large site acquisitions with operating subsidies coming from the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, and then did sort of homeless referrals into some of those buildings that made sense. So that was sort of another financing strategy that we used, and that could potentially be used for some like large site acquisitions and stuff.
Other questions?
Hey, so I'm wondering about tenant income certification. So if you have an occupied property, and I may have missed this at the beginning, if you have an occupied property and part of the acquisition money that's coming in or part of the permanent financing is dependent upon the tenants being income qualified, how do you start that process? So when do you initiate it? What do you do with the tenants who are over income? How do you monitor so that upon turnover, you do have income qualified people coming into units that maybe were formerly occupied by somebody over income? That sort of process for managing a property that you would like to steward into the future as one that has lasting affordability on many or most of the units, but may not have income qualified folks in all of those units at the time.
So that's one of the challenges. I mean, that's one of the challenges why developers don't many times buy these buildings, because one of the things that we want to do, we want to be careful that we don't displace folks, right? So I think it's a hard call depending on the size of the project. I think you can make the argument that if you buy a property in this neighborhood, and pick your neighborhood, the likelihood that they're going to all be low income is pretty high. Again, depending where you're at. So I think from a developer's perspective, I need to be okay that 5-10%, whatever it is, are not. And I have to be okay as a developer that we're going to have to relocate these folks at a certain time, whenever that time is. The great thing about our program was that it was just private money. There was no need for tenant certifications. We just wanted to know that there was a tenant and that they didn't pay rent because of COVID. That was kind of it. But I think what you said is, when we approach other acquisitions, those are the issues that we deal with, because many times these landlords, they're not going to want to do a tenant certification. They're not going to do a tenant estoppel. And if they are, they're going to want to do it after your money goes hard, after all your due diligence, and right before you close. And then at that point, you've already spent $75,000, $100,000 on your due diligence, and then you're going to find out that folks are not. And then you're going to need to decide, what are you going to do? Are you going to move forward with it or not? That's just one of the challenges of being a developer. But I know exactly what you're talking about. It's not easy. It's hard.
I feel like I keep citing San Francisco examples. I swear I work at Enterprise now, but I'm just speaking from like most recent experience. The small sites program in San Francisco does require as close to 100% income certification before acquisition, which is a really big challenge. But the developers that work in San Francisco generally have pretty robust resident engagement teams who really spend a lot of time building trust with residents and helping collect those income certifications. So I think in San Francisco, that's how that's worked. Oakland, I don't think that that's a requirement for their program. So they do their best to use like a rent roll and like have estimates and then do some more sort of front end conservative underwriting on like welfare tax exemption assumptions for those households that might be over the state required AMI.
And I know I'm the moderator, but just to chime in, I think that this also is a bit of a values question. Like when thinking about the NOAA housing stock in particular, we were talking about preserving that housing at a below market rent. So it's similar to almost like a rent control model, right? Where you're fixing in that stock at a certain price versus worrying about the tenants. And there's obviously questions on, who's living in these and maybe filtering process. But a lot of the data that Lori shared and that Urban Institute has done too is that there is this natural kind of filtering that happens where you do have lower income people who live in these units. And so if we can get more data, right, to test that out, but instead kind of focus on keeping that housing price at that amount, like how would that potentially change how we do these programs too? I don't know. I think to me it's also just a question of who are we making jump the most hoops, right? And how are we kind of building out some of the design of these programs? And anyway.
If I could say Roberto, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, I think if we try to answer this question solely as affordable housing developers, then we'll continue to have the same issues that we have, right? But I think if we start addressing this as partnerships in terms of who are the community organizations doing the tenant advocacy, the bringing in the resources around tenant rights, and identifying and like getting to know the community that lives in these NOAA properties, then developers could do their job a lot better. And then we have partners that understand the population that needs the most support in like building the empowerment for tenants to improve their living conditions alongside an affordable housing developer. And I've seen that played out at least in like East LA, where we have these partnerships and where we're doing these like acquisitions, where for us it's really important that we are working with folks who have already gone and done the like Know Your Rights workshop at the NOAA property, and I've identified the different needs beyond just like the building being rehabbed, so that when we go in there, it's really clear that we're working with the population that we need to be working with, and that there's a pipeline of acquisitions in our neighborhood that we're working in. So yeah, I think for me, and then it also helps CDFIs understand what are the gaps in terms of NOAA's being like preserved. And I think one of the biggest things that I think Alejandro said is that the products don't exist. And so an example of at least LA County is that we got grants to acquire NOAA properties, which is like unheard of. And it's like something that, from the past or something, like Alejandro saying, from like 1996 or something.
Hey, I'm not there.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's like, I think so I think for us, it's not loan products. Like we actually need grants from the public sector and from philanthropy, like CCI or Irvine Foundation, or folks who can really invest in that.
No, that's great. I love that theme of partnership, collaboration, and everyone in, because I think we really need that. Other questions? I think I saw some more hands up. The woman in purple, and then.
I just want to say, because there's a lot of talk about acquisition, but several people have brought up stuff about operations and asset management. Nonprofits cannot operate the way a individual homeowner, building owner can operate. They're probably self-insuring, so they have a very high deductible. Nonprofits can't do that. We have very low deductibles. We can't have that exposure. We have to pay for an audit, and other things. We have to satisfy HQS. We have to, if there's a drop of any kind of public money, we've got to do some more reasonable accommodations and things like that. We can't operate the way a individual building owner might be operating. Maybe he's doing all his own books. Maybe he's, like I said, having a high deductible. There's just a lot of ways that they operate that we cannot operate. We're under public scrutiny. We're under more financial scrutiny. We're trying to satisfy funders who often have a lot of requirements and want to really know what's going on with the building. And so what we find is that there's a need for soft money, and several people have said that. But I mean, I just really think that what if we want to do a welfare exemption because people do income qualify? Well, you've got to have an asset management team that can do that. All that is layers of overhead that the guy who owns an 8-unit building in East LA, he doesn't deal with all that stuff. He doesn't have those costs and that sophistication. And so I'm just bringing that up because the need for soft money in this market is really, really critical. I work for a housing authority that owns 50 scattered site units. They range from condos to single homes to fourplexes, and they were all bought with grants to ourselves. And they operate at a loss. They operate at a loss annually. And maybe, we're a housing authority, maybe we're a little more expensive than even a nonprofit, but not that much. They operate at a loss, and, they're kind of a labor of love, but they're a place for, 50 households to live in. And that's a pretty significant, activity for us as a city. We can't do more than that, though, because we can't get our money out of those deals until we sell those deals. And if we sell the deals, guess what's going to happen? Someone's going to jack up the rents. Because we can't sell them to a nonprofit. They can't operate it really much cheaper than we can. So I want people to think about that, the long term. How does the long term get dealt with?
So I'm smiling because you're explaining what I'm living with, right? Everything you said is true. And I wish I had a magic 8 ball I could just shake and it could just give me the answer on how to solve it. Because, you know, the problem is based on today's market value for these properties, and what you said at the very end is just stunning. You can't even give it away because they'll operate at a loss. But what you said just highlights a very critical part of it. These deals are being sold, and somebody is making these work. And you're right, government agencies are not as efficient as an individual or as mom and pop family operating these. And yes, they could be very creative in terms of how they survive, because in many cases, these are not cash cows. They're making enough just to survive. And it's, I think for me, we have to be careful on how we communicate with them, because, you know, in many cases, this is their asset. This is their retirement. I don't want to come in and say, this is how we manage it. You know, what we're trying to ask is, you know, how can we, through this collaborative, be helpful to you? What do you need? And honestly, we've had to pivot. We've had to just be more creative, because when we hear their stories or what they need, we sometimes get a different answer. So there's a lot in what you said, but I think when I think about how we could be more effective, I try to just simplify it, and sometimes to my fault. I look at the numbers and I say, okay, it's being sold at whatever it is. Based on these rents, I can afford a mortgage of $1 million, let's say. It's being sold for $2 million. I have a gap of $1 million. Who's going to put it in? Is it the city? Is it the county? Is it a foundation? If it's the city, you're right. Or the county, it's going to trigger prevailing wage. It's going to trigger ADA, which is, again, not bad things, but there's a cost to that. But then there's the logistics. How do we do these upgrades, for example, if it's ADA, with people living there? Now we have to relocate them, right? Because sometimes, so I wish there was an easy answer. I think a solution would be if we had the ability to get a just conventional mortgage and maybe a foundation to step in without having to get city or county money, that would solve a lot of the problems, because then we would not have to pay, do these other improvements. We wouldn't have to pay prevailing wages or whatever it is. I think that's how we could be more efficient. And I just said a foundation because investors, what they have is investors. They have a money person, right? They also get, many cases, a conventional loan, and then they have money. And then they have to make that return. And then that's the problem that they run into, is that how are they going to get their return? By relocating, displacing, harassing, what have you. And we have to just be more creative to figure out how can we do, how can we buy these and preserve these?
I was going to actually go in a slightly different direction with that response. I mean, I think what the nonprofit community is doing with affordable housing is unbelievably wonderful, given resource constraints.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there are resource constraints, and I think sort of what we've seen is a lot of mom and pop investors selling to larger institutional entities, because the next mom and pop investor that would have bought 2 decades ago, it's too expensive for them to buy now, and they can't get the necessary financing. So I come down to sort of financing for that next generation of mom and pop investors, and maybe you want to have some sort of a certification where some of these guys could be affordable housing mom and pop investors, so where they get certain first look rights, but certainly sort of improving the financing for the next generation of mom and pops sort of seems to me like a really scalable alternative.
The only thing I would add there, so double snaps on the soft debt and making sure that that's available and long term. To the I hear those double snaps. The other thing that we have talked a little bit about and exploring is this sort of talking about like sort of joint asset management functions. There's definitely a lot of different CDCs that are starting to form and get into get into preservation work, to what extent does it make sense for some of those developers to work together to manage those assets so that like not individual CDCs are hiring an asset management staff member? Like, can we think of some model in which those asset management and property management functions are sort of aggregated? So that's just what
Totally. And I remember learning from the Joe model, or I can't remember now where I was for the LROC program, that mom and pop owners actually paid on average 20% more in operations than other bigger institutional owners, nonprofit or for-profit, because of that economies of scale that you were mentioning.
I'd like to ask you one more question. Can I take a look at that portfolio?
That 50 units. All right, I think we got time for one more question.
In the back. In the back. There's the gentleman.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Well, maybe this is I guess a parting thought and question, but I know it was said before, but I just want to emphasize, listening to all this, seems like part of what we're wrestling with is that it's really a spectrum of types of properties, scales of properties, required approaches. A lot's out of our control because it's determined by kind of the capacity of the seller to provide information. And I think part of that too, it rests on us to help stick to a definition. And I mean, I think, I'm a CDFI lender and we've done some transactions for unsubsidized acquisitions. It's obviously easier when it is closer to market and you have a slimmer discrepancy. And I think there's a lot of forces going around right now that are making people question, and I think one of the audience members asked this kind of less pointedly, but just kind of defining what is a viable benefit to the community. I mean, in our experiences, we saw in-place tenants in a building with rents at 80% AMI making 350% AMI. And, letting their lease roll and letting them move on to find housing that they're still able to, attain, and putting someone more closely aligned that income qualifies, to me that's a big benefit. That's kind of right housing someone who otherwise would be displaced in a different sort of sense. And I think where we're used to this model of deeply subsidized housing, it's very visual, it's very clear. This is much messier in terms of kind of who gets what benefit, how much, what do the developers need to sustain themselves, what tax basis does the city and county and state still need to sustain itself. So I mean, I think, there's a lot of great minds and people interested in policy in the room, and I think clarification on these will help us be able to kind of segment financial products to address each of these situations. Maybe not a question, but I don't know if anyone has a reaction, but.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think we learned a lot. I mean, I think we could talk about this probably all day. There's a lot more to discuss. But thank you guys all for your time, and thank you.